The 7-year kidnapping and torture of Colleen Stan is one of the most extreme and outrageous cases we've ever covered on this channel. I need to warn you right now that this is a hard one to listen to. I'll try to be as tactful as I can, but no matter how delicately I try to phrase what you're about to hear, it's going to be a rough one to sit through. Because the torture of Colleen at the hands of the worst kind of sexual sadist is nothing short of horrific. This is the story of Colleen Stan, the girl who lived inside a coffin-like wooden box for 7 years. Let us start at the beginning. May the 19th, 1977. Colleen was a 20-year-old typical young woman of the 70s. She was on her way to undertake a 600-mile hitchhike journey from her hometown of Eugene, Oregon, all the way to Northern California to attend a friend's birthday party. If that doesn't scream 1970s free-spirited hippie-era America, I don't know what does. Colleen really wasn't out of the ordinary for this time. Many kids, some much younger than her, traveled all over the country for much less reason in exactly the same way. She actually turned down 2 rides that morning because she didn't feel safe getting into a vehicle with only male drivers. So, when a young couple along with their 8-month-old baby stopped next to her, Colleen felt perfectly secure getting into their vehicle. Unfortunately, Cameron, 23, and Janice Hooker, just 19 years old, were not the wholesome family that they painted themselves to be. Just a year before, Cameron kidnapped, tortured, and killed 19-year-old Marie Elizabeth Spanicky, whose body still hasn't been found. Cameron and Janice had been looking for a replacement for their previous victim for some time, and sadly, Colleen just happened to be at the right place at the right time, for the Hookers at least. Ironically enough, she did have an opportunity to run in those first few hours, even though the couple were perfectly pleasant during the drive. Colleen experienced an overwhelming sense of dread during a bathroom break at a gas station. She recalls that while in the restroom, a voice in her head screamed at her to run and to never look back. But she brushed it off as being overly cautious and got back in the car anyway. Not long after that, her intuition proved to be spot on. Just 20 minutes later, the couple pulled over, and while Janice took her baby on a walk, Cameron drew a knife on his newest victim. He tied her up and placed a box over her head, a box that Cameron had crafted himself specifically for this purpose. Wooden, soundproof, and locked by a padlock, it was designed to encase her in complete silence and darkness. This elaborate contraption would be perfectly at home in a Saw movie, and it should give you an idea of how convoluted and bizarre Cameron's fantasy world truly was. This entire arrangement to kidnap a sex slave between Janice and Cameron came out of Cameron's extreme abuse of his wife, once almost resulting in her death when he nearly drowned her in a bathtub during his extreme bondage experiments that most often involved whips, restraints, and assaults involving household objects. I'm being intentionally vague with my wording here, otherwise the YouTube overlords will have some repercussions for this channel. But let me put it this way. Cameron's sexual fantasies turned into reality was so dangerous that he risked killing his wife, and Janice was so timid and submissive that she did not pose any resistance to his suggestion of procuring a sex slave. And the torture that he was about to inflict upon Colleen was comparable to what happened inside a medieval torture chamber. We can hate Janice for what she allowed to happen all we want, but her entire life was rife with abuse, from her cruel and neglectful parents all the way to her incredibly disturbed husband's demands. Janice was molded to go along with this inhumane treatment since the day she was born. And Cameron was a master of breaking women's resolve and getting into their heads. The only condition Janice had for Cameron was that he not sexually penetrate Colleen because she did not want her children to have half-siblings that needed to be explained somehow. Not that Cameron kept that promise, but Janice hoped that he'd be satisfied with all of the other creative tortures he had on the table. And boy, was that table laid out with horrors that we've only ever read about in sleazy horror paperbacks. When they arrived at the Hooker home, Colleen was introduced to even more torture devices that Cameron had built himself. To increase the complete breakdown of her mind, Colleen was not allowed to bathe for the first 3 months of her captivity. She was starved to such extremes that she lost 23 pounds in the first month. She was stripped of her name, only referred to as K, electrocuted, cut, assaulted, and beaten. Weeks went by when she was sentenced to silence, and if she dared utter a word, she'd be beaten for her transgression. For 8 months, she was blindfolded before being allowed to take the cover off her eyes. But worst of all, she was placed inside another, larger box, soundproof, pitch dark, and in complete sensory isolation, deprived of all sensory input for 23 hours a day. The only time she was let out was to endure more suffering involving tortures and sexual assaults geared towards hurting her as much as possible, or she was let out to cook, to clean, and to babysit the couple's child. The rest of the day, she was stowed inside that box, right under the hooker's bed. When Colleen's resolve had broken down totally, Cameron made her sign a contract, agreeing to sign away her life to the man that she was forced to call master. After 3 years of this, Colleen was allowed to go for a jog every now and then, and left alone while doing yard work or minding the house, but she never ran, not even once. Cameron had completely convinced her that if she did, a sinister organization called the Company would kill her and her entire family. She fully believed that they surveilled her every move, that even her internal thoughts weren't her own. And Janice, she accepted this like the dutiful wife she was expected to be. Cameron forbade her from going to the hospital for the birth of their second child, forcing Janice to give birth on their bed while Colleen was shut inside her wooden box right underneath them. In '81, 4 years into her captivity, Cameron allowed his prisoner to visit her family. The Stans were concerned and confused. Their daughter had been missing for 4 years, and here she was with a pleasant man who claimed to be her boyfriend. They believed that she joined a cult of some kind, but she looked relatively happy, if a little skinny. So they were gentle with the odd arrangement, fearing that they'd scare her away if they pressed her too hard for answers. Her mother begged her to take a picture because she didn't know when she'd see Colleen again. This lucky snapshot would later be used as a vital piece of evidence. This visit was sufficient to quell any further questions and to remove Colleen's missing person status. She was more isolated than ever. Cameron was afraid that the small sliver of freedom would undo all of his brutal brainwashing. In retaliation, he put Colleen back inside the box, going back to his arrangement of only allowing her an hour of torture a day. Not even the couple's 2 daughters realized what was going on. For the brief time that Colleen was given more freedom, they thought that she was their live-in babysitter. And when Kay disappeared, they were told that she'd gotten another job. To reassert his dominance, he placed a newspaper clipping of his previous victim, Elizabeth Spanicky, with her ID next to it, just outside the box. Colleen had one small crack through which she could see daylight, and that clipping was put right in front of it to remind her of what would happen to her if she ever resisted. For 3 more years, this was once again all Colleen knew. The only reprieve she got from her eternity in darkness came when Janice secretly let her out while Cameron was at work so that they could read the Bible together, and she would sneak Colleen whatever food she thought Cameron wouldn't notice had disappeared from the fridge. At the end of those 3 years, in 1983, Colleen was allowed to babysit the children again, and she even started to work part-time as a maid. Predictably, her wages all went to the Hooker household. Cameron also allowed Janice to take Colleen with her to church. This connection between the 2 women, as strange as it was a pivotal shift in what was to transpire within the next year. It was Janice that finally broke the spell. Remember, she was being abused by Cameron too, and had been since she was only 15 years old. She'd always kept her mouth shut and accepted her own share of the abuse, given that her husband, at least in some strange way, remained hers and hers alone. That is until Cameron suggested that Colleen become his second wife. But this demand from Cameron was just too much for her. So, on August 9, 1984, Janice told Colleen that the mysterious organization that he referred to only as the Company was a complete fabrication. The only thing keeping her there was Colleen herself. She could leave at any time. That was the day Colleen walked to a bus station, called Cameron at work, and told him that she was leaving him. After 7 years of explosive anger, Cameron didn't scream, he did not shout. Instead, he cried. She put down the receiver and took the bus back to her family. But Colleen didn't tell another soul about her 7 years of hell, not just yet. After 7 years of psychological and physical torture, she was still very much in the complete throes of Stockholm Syndrome. She both loved and hated her captor. She helped him construct new, more extreme contraptions to torment herself with, and she'd become so dependent on Cameron and his approval that she couldn't wrap her head around the ideas that he could possibly have lied all these years. It was that deeply embedded belief that kept her quiet for months. She was sure that at any moment the company would storm in, kill her entire family, and sell her off to another master who was even worse than Cameron. She even continued to call the Hooker household to talk to Cameron, sure that he could change, that deep down he was a good person. Janice again stepped up and brought this entire terrible years-long crime to the surface. 3 months after Colleen left, she went to see her pastor and confessed everything. Her abuse at her husband's hands, starting at the age of 15, the previous murder, and then Colleen's captivity that lasted 7 whole years. He convinced her to tell her story to the police and sat with her through that interrogation too. When police located Colleen to confirm this outrageous tale, it didn't take them long to discover all of the evidence in the house. The box of isolation, the head box, the torture racks, countless magazines and implements, all related to extreme BDSM and torture, and the secret chamber built under the shed filled with chains and electrical devices, all made to inflict as much pain as possible. Not to mention boxes filled with photos of Colleen being used in ways more terrible than they'd ever seen a human being endure. The court proceedings were complicated to say the least. First off, Janice was granted immunity if she testified against her husband, a move which has been heavily criticized by the public. Most would agree that Janice was as much a victim as Colleen was, some even arguing that she suffered for much longer than the kidnapped victim. But others feel that because Janice assisted with the kidnapping and some of the torture, and that she remained silent about it for nearly a decade, that she was just as guilty. But if it wasn't for Janice, not only would Colleen never have gotten away from this monster, it would never have been reported at all. Cameron's legal team argued that yes, the kidnapping was unlawful, but after a few months, Colleen stayed voluntarily, and all of the things that were done to her were consensual. It was hard to argue with that fact, given that Colleen was granted freedoms. She never told her parents during her visit to them. She was in contact with people from work, the church, and neighbors, and the love letters that she wrote to Cameron during her time in captivity were a huge point of contention, detailing the true scope of Stockholm Syndrome and just how all-encompassing Colleen's dependency on her kidnapper had become was a strange concept in the 80s. But jurors were convinced when they saw the torture contraptions and were allowed to get into the wooden box that the victim spent 23 hours a day in. In the end, it took them a whole week to come to a conclusion. Cameron Hooker was found guilty of all 19 counts, totaling up to 104 years behind bars. The last time his parole was denied was in 2022, and it's unlikely that he'll ever see the outside world again. Janice and her daughters have disappeared from the public eye, and no one but authorities know where they are. And Colleen? She's done everything in her power to live as normal a life as possible. She studied accounting, got married, had a daughter, and went through a divorce. She's written a book and spends her free time counseling kidnapped victims and advising professionals how to help women who have survived violent sexual crimes. She knew that after the media frenzy around her case that she'd always be known as the girl in the box, so she decided not to let that title dictate her life. Instead, she would utilize that name to help as many victims as she could. Unfortunately, the disappearance of Elizabeth Spanicki has never officially been solved. Colleen swears she saw the ID and the newspaper clipping, but it's never been found either. And since there is no body, no weapon, and no evidence of her at any of the Hookers' homes, well, it's unlikely that we'll ever see justice for Elizabeth and the terrible fate that Cameron Hooker forced upon her.